And so on and so on. And so on and so on. And so on and so on.
Do you manage to get Jake on board? He said, I'll try to make it. Just might not be possible.
Hey.
Hey. So this is the first episode that we're starting without Jacob. This is the fabled and so on. Jake, if you're listening, we want you back. We miss you. Stop by anytime. Come back, baby. Good luck with all your work.
What's the go, fellas?
Jake's busy is the reason that he's not here. I know that he wants to be here, but he's busy. So we forgive him for that. He'll be back again soon. Yeah. How are we doing? Well, by the way, the leftovers are Peter, Will, and Michael, and this is Zizek and So On. This is the excremental remainder of Zizek and So On.
How are the boys? What are you up to?
It's my girlfriend's birthday tomorrow.
Ooh.
So I'm getting in the zone. Any big plans? I'm gonna take her out to the beach. Might see some blues guitar. Yeah. That place has graffiti. Hold on, I sent you guys a photo of it. I think it bears mention. I was in the stall at the bathroom and it says, "Do you poop with a marker? Yes or no." And of course, the only way that you would be able to mark anything is if you had a marker. The only problem is that there's no red ink vibe in there. Yeah, that's really. I guess there's only the backup. The backup, the brown ink.
Jesus.
And how about you? I hesitate to say down under, but maybe I just did. You said that last time, word for word.
Word for word.
I said the exact same thing. Fuck. Yeah. Did you cut that? You edited it. You left it in. Oh, I guess I didn't listen to it. I am not going to hesitate to say it. How's it going, Michael?
Good, man. It's raining again, so the roof is leaking. And I made a coffee.
You're attempting this without a coffee. That's quite a feat.
No, I'm having a coffee this time. Usually I just have tea. So I'll probably be like, fucking hype. No, I have tea as well. I have to have like 10 cups of caffeine to get the outline of a human being.
Or the Jake level of like the massive jar of tea.
Yeah. Well, my cat smashed mine. I've only got a baby one now. Piggy. Right. Divine violence, hey?
Well, I think just violence in general.
Thank God.
Oh, yeah. That means we're doing this week, we're doing Zizek's writing on violence, written about in his book, Violence. I think it's one of his most popular books, is it not? It's definitely up there. It's a great way in to Zizek, I find. Yeah, this was actually the first Zizek book that I read. I think me too. And I remember like reading Lacan and being like, what the fuck is this? There are a couple passages in the copy that I still have where I just have a question mark. Which I don't. Can you read a passage? Maybe we can answer your question from when you first read it. I get it now. I mean, it's pretty. Yeah. But, the passage reads, actual universality is not the deep feeling that above all differences, different civilizations share the same basic values, etc. Actual universality actualizes itself as the experience of negativity, of the inadequacy to itself of a particular identity, which I actually think is kind of straightforward now. Mm-hmm. But I think that at the time I didn't understand what universal or particular meant, and certainly not what negativity meant in this context. Had not read Hegel yet. Yeah. And I can see how it would be confusing if you think that national identity is a kind of positive, like an accumulation of positive characteristics, and then trying to connect that with some sort of like through line between all different types and worlds, etc. Yeah, and also the closeness of the terms of universality and negativity, I think I had a hard time accessing. And also this notion of the inadequacy to itself of a particular identity, because I think I was, in my earlier 20s when I read this. And to me, the particular identity is the most important thing, right? It's the access to the world, the most important feature of the world in a way.
A little
In my
existentialist.
Yeah, in the existentialist way, yeah. But
Well,
we'll
you're an
get there.
idiot.
I was an idiot. Still am.
Just in a different way, a more
Yeah.
nuanced way. You at every stage, you think of your previous self as a total idiot, which of course you will think about your current self in the future.
You were always missing. You go back and you read. You're always missing the red ink or something.
Yeah.
That's also a good way to approach the idea of the difference between the past and the present for this concept of violence. That you have to think of. You have to think of the way in which the past is constituted not through the lens of the present, but how the present itself is, in a sense, past from some future vantage.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And isn't it also like in the kind of Benjaminian sense, or what Zizek is rendering as Benjaminian sense as well, of like the heaped up violence and struggle of the past is the present.
Yeah, he references Sloterdijk in saying that the history of Western culture is the history of
Rage and Time is the book.
Rage.
Yeah.
Yeah, banks of rage.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read any Sloterdijk?
I have
A bit, yeah. You Must Change Your Life. I read a good amount of.
I read all of that book. Thank you very much. And I also read What Happened in the 20th Century and a chunk of Spheres and a good portion of The World Interior of Capital, which I think is actually maybe his most interesting one. They're all really interesting. They're not like he is a conservative. He's a small C conservative.
Like I heard Zizek say today, don't get me wrong, he still goes to the gulag.
Yeah. He's still,
that's right.
Sloterdijk is interesting. Like, he is a prodigious producer of concepts, which is very exciting to read. In his book World Interior of Capital, he does have he's not pro-capitalist, really. I mean, he's not pro-capitalist. He does have a critique of capitalism in his work in that book. But he does have a nice phrase that Zizek commonly references, like the truth. This is paraphrasing, but like the truth of the capitalist age isn't that the Earth revolves around the sun; it's that capital moves around the Earth, or something like that. And also just this idea of this sort of like interior sphere of the of capital, of the capitalist world, where there is an inside and there is an outside, and the archetypical figure or like example of this for Sloterdijk is the Crystal Palace that burned down, that was built I think outside London in the mid 1800s, and it was this huge interior structure that displayed all the riches of the empire. And he said that this is still the way that you can conceptualize capitalism, as sort of the containing the warmth and the depths of the far reaches of the empire and the riches of it, and then the outside that is sort of
where from where it plunders its riches.
Yeah,
with Sloterdijk, he is an authentic philosopher, and that's maybe what's most interesting about him. It's like the tradition of philosophy still seems to be very much alive with him, and he references almost nothing in his books. It's all basically original concepts, and his language is nuanced and bizarre and idiosyncratic.
Where's he from? Germany?
Germany. Yeah. I actually went to I visited his hometown, not because of that, but it was close by where I was living, Karlsruhe. I can never pronounce it. But it was this nice German town. You could picture him biking around.
Jake says, "Sorry, fellas, it's not gonna work for me." Yeah, fuck you, man. You know what? You're not gonna work for us, Jake.
What would he say? He's like, "Well, boys, I'm excited." That'll do for Jake.
We're gonna do without Jake's excitement. Okay. What strikes me as so interesting about this book is that, well, one, it's such a good example of Zizekian intervention. Like we kind of think we know spontaneously what violence is, but he does a great job of completely complicating the concept, because his basic kind of premise is that violence isn't either good or bad. And
yes,
depending on the context, it becomes one of those things. It becomes a way to either continue the oppression of capitalism and of etc., or there's a kind of potential in it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, he has a quote where he's saying the first step towards breaking the deadlock here is to distinguish as clearly as possible between two types of violence: radical emancipatory violence against the violence which serves the continuation and or establishment of hierarchical relations of exploitation and domination.
Right. But it seems like these are two features of what you might call objective violence versus subjective violence, which is the initial distinction that he draws in the book, I think, right? So, okay, so what's subjective violence? When we think of, I think this is it. Like when we think of violence, what we think of is subjective violence. Things that happen to people acted on them by other people or actors.
Yeah. Murders, physical assault,
mob
direct
violence,
acts of violence,
police violence, domestic violence.
But yeah, this is the subjective violence he opposes to objective violence, which is not experienced in the same way in that it is not directly experienced.
Yeah, the link between subjective violence and objective violence is subjective violence has a clear identifiable agent, so either an actor or an agent, and the objective background that overdetermines this form of violence is objective violence.
Right. And
so
subjective
violence is a symptom of objective violence.
Yeah. So
that's nice.
But what then is objective violence? Like, okay, we can't see it, but we also can't see subjective violence that happens around us. So what makes objective violence different than typical violence? To answer that question, I think you can say, well, this is what Zizek says. Like, objective violence is the violence that is always at work in sustaining the normal run of our lives, of our comfortable Western lives. I mean, it obviously has different iterations in different places, but generally speaking, objective violence is violence necessary for the system to run itself.
Yeah, to perpetuate. So it's the invisible background that allows the system to reproduce.
It's the kind of the zero level of our experience. We might think that the kind of normal function of our lives is non-violent, but it's the violence that is necessitated for our very kind of existence in the world.
But this is how people normally like. Michael, we were talking about Simon Critchley's rejection of this book, right? And you can read, maybe we can post it, but you can read in his sort of lambasting of Zizek's book is like this basic shock of like, how can you speak with such impertinence about violence, right? But I think that as Peter, you pointed out before, like what Zizek is doing is trying to make a kind of like impartial, trying to treat violence impartially, not taking a side in discussing violence.
Well, because violence is supposed to make speaking about violence is supposed to make us feel a certain way. We're supposed to speak about it in a very kind of like hushed and respectful tone. But Zizek's point is that doesn't allow for thinking.
This is something that people always have a problem with Zizek with, right? Is that he'll throw something out, like we'll start talking about some horrific like act of racism or whatever, and he'll throw it out there somewhat impertinently, and it offends that feeling of that you have to treat certain things with like the proper reverence or discretion.
Like it's right on the pandemic, like people were shocked that how could he speak so soon about that sort of thing. He writes, actually, there's a good quote from the book. He writes, "There are reasons for looking at the problem of violence awry. My underlying premise is that there is something inherently mystifying in a direct confrontation with it. The overpowering horror of violent acts and empathy which the victims inextricably function as a lore which prevents us from thinking."
That's the issue with subjective violence, right? Like people always are trying to situate it within moral agents or actors. So it's Soros is to blame, not the system, for a type of objective violence.
That, as well as like the way you feel itself, is meant to be a kind of moral lesson or the kind of point of pointing to violence. So like the kind of tolerant liberal approach, I would say the kind of hegemonic ideological state we find ourselves in, is to harness that feeling of horror we feel in the face of violence and feel just kind of good that we feel that way. Like that's kind of enough.
Yeah, you've done it. You've done enough by identifying the fact that you feel bad about the violence that's occurring in the world.
Yeah, or just many of Zizek's examples that kind of broach this type of feeling, like buying organic food, and like just the feeling of buying organic food that itself is the point of buying it. Or like I'm kind of getting lost.
No, you got it. Like it's the liberal sensibility, right? It reminds me. I don't know. This doesn't have much to do with violence, although it actually does have to do with objective violence. I think. Like, I don't know if this friend actually listens. It's an old friend. Knew him in university. He since has become an investment banker in London, and I saw on his on Instagram that he was going to Scotland to participate in the COP26 protests, which I thought was so beautiful. This, because if you were to say like, okay, what does more for or against the climate crisis? Speculation of banking or protesting at the COP26? Right?
Yeah, or just looking at a protest, just being around the general area.
Well, that's one of the issues with subjective violence, right? Like it compels you to see it in isolation.
Yeah. So like, I mean, I love this guy, but he, his actual activities, could like contribute in this powerful way to sustaining the system versus something that you do on a subjective level that makes you feel better about.
Yeah, I mean, the classic like posting like last year during the Black Lives Matter protests, just like posting on social media itself as a kind of political act. When really, what does that do? It's not. It's not exactly taking to the streets in a kind of Zizekian. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but violent event. There's like, but he talks about, so there's kind of subjective and objective violence, but he also kind of nuances that into three different types of violence. There's symbolic, mystic, and divine violence. And that's the kind of basic structure of the book.
Mythic.
Oh, what did I?
Mystic.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, mythic.
You're playing with the I Ching again.
So like sometimes violence itself is kind of impotent acting out, and that's kind of where he starts the book. And sometimes it maintains the system, and sometimes it's a way of engaging that system. But maybe starting with that acting out, this is the kind of horizon of what we regularly think of as like people taking to the streets.
Occupy.
Yeah, Occupy the protests last year.
And would you believe it that I think a lot of people know this, but one of the main Occupy dudes is now resident at the Davos a festival for rich sickos. I mean, like, yeah.
It's too good. And then I think the other guy was fucking Tim Pool, who's a total fucking idiot.
Can one of you help me? Can you define symbolic violence?
Language.
Yeah.
Basically,
I don't. It's not language like microaggressions. Like I'm picking up on the unavowed violence of your relation to me. It's more the structure of language itself is a kind of violence.
Yeah, it's like how we as subjects enter language. It is a violent kind of confrontation, right? Like something about overabundance of meaning of language in relation to us trying to like use it is for Zizek a kind of violence. And in that way, he doesn't mean violence in the negative sense. It's a kind of dislocating effect that language has on.
Yeah. The dislocation, the abstraction of language too. He
compares it to the house of being, the Heideggerian concept.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the symbolic order, I think he understands as a kind of place of violence.
Because also violence occurs. I think it's not too difficult to see the contours of what you might call symbolic violence. What would be an example? Did he include any examples of symbolic violence in this?
Not that I found.
I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think he just
kind of touches on it and moves on. But it reminded me of another one of the kind of liberal solutions or reactions to perceived violence is, the concept of the microaggression, right? Like the implications of language become a subjectively felt place of politics, and like that's the complete horizon of what to do about greater social issues, is to kind of police the language that's spoken, when of course much of the interest, and Zizek points to this, like often that perceived slight is, something that's racist or sexist, etc., at which are serious issues, but to understand them as the way to solve them is by dealing with it subjectively, is of course
that's
very
the
kernel
liberal,
what Zizek is opposed to.
It's the liberal like finger wagging, like everyone has to act correctly all the time, versus seeing it as issues of that reach beyond the mere subjective instantiation of that sort of moment of violence or whatever. Very quickly, Michael, he does say, I think maybe in the lecture we were listening to, all violence is a sign of something you cannot put into words. Even the most brutal violence is the enacting of a certain symbolic deadlock within the ideological space of capitalism, but without the means to realize it. So maybe like symbolic violence there is like, because he's using the language like it's a sign of something you cannot put into words. I mean, words also.
Would an example that he uses be Picasso?
Oh yeah, that's interesting.
I think that falls under that category, where the story in World War II, Picasso is painting in his studio in Paris, and the Germans demand to see what he's working on. And once they see this very kind of like violent work,
I think
it's Guernica, right?
yeah, they're like, "What have you done?" He's like, "No, you have done this.
You did this." Yeah.
Yeah, I think that actually could be understood as symbolic violence.
I think art in general could be perceived as an engagement with violence. Not maybe in general. Like I hate the concept of like all art is political. I find that to be a very annoying concept. Political art is political, but that's for another time.
Also, as an aside, political art is usually bad. Just saying.
This is true.
Yeah. So okay. So he says the project of the book is let's not demonize violence precisely because the zero level normal state of things already involves violence. Okay. So we've gotten this far.
Just briefly, this is reminiscent for me of the debate with Peterson, where Zizek, like main kernel of his argument against Peterson, who's of course going on about cleaning your room as a solution to the issues in your life and the world, starting with yourself. And Zizek said, maybe my room is in disorder because the world is in disorder. And I think that kind of touches on the more conservative relationship to violence is precisely the subjective one. They always talk about gang violence and it's all these things, but they either do not recognize or refuse to acknowledge the fact that this type of violence is the result of a much deeper cause. The way that the system functions normally.
How can you pull yourself up from your bootstraps if the very conditions themselves prohibit it?
So, but yeah, moving on to maybe we should talk about tolerance.
Yeah,
I was excited.
Let's not include this, but I read this early this morning and I was like, boom, boom, this is awesome. And then I was rereading it and I got totally lost.
about
I
what?
couldn't understand why he was. Let me see if I can reconstruct this. He's talking about the ideology of tolerance as being the ideology of capitalism. Multiculturalist tolerance is the ideology of contemporary capitalism. And he says that if it's founded on a certain notion of the subject, the Cartesian subject. Like
I'm a bit confused because Zizek is fairly into the notion of the Cartesian subject, but one which is a negative void, the I as negativity. Yeah. And I think maybe what you're pointing to is, I think should be opposed to the notion of the multicultural subject, which is an I of positive traits.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And where tolerance enters the discussion is, like we were alluding to earlier with the kind of liberal response to violence, is to merely recognize it and to take that recognition as a political act. So we don't do anything about it. We tolerate it.
Yeah, right.
And then with he references, what at this point with the watered down liberal figure of Martin Luther King. Whereas if you actually go through the history of Martin Luther King's speeches and writings, the word tolerance is almost entirely absent. He viewed overcoming racism as a kind of economic
it's a struggle.
Demand.
Yeah. It's not a matter of tolerating the conditions.
Yeah, and he just calls this as like, how humiliating would it be, in the fight against sexism for men to merely tolerate women? It's a kind of ridiculous position to have.
Okay, so I realized that the thing that he's aiming at in Tolerance as an Ideological Category, that chapter, is trying to show the persistence of the need to view the subject as universal and not merely as a result of cultural conditions or as just one type in relation to other types, one type of subjectivity in relation to other types, versus what he wants to emphasize is the abstract universality of the subject.
What the subject like shares with the universal.
That the subject is universal.
Yeah. Just to finesse the point a little bit.
Yeah.
Whereas tolerance would recognize the subject as particular. Like
Yes,
there's
exactly, yeah.
this type of subject over here and that one over there, and they must tolerate each other. And in so doing, we create a more inclusive and caring society.
So, but then what you get out of viewing subject as an abstract universal category is, yes, there's the specific conditions under which they live and which bump against one another and in some sense exclude one another's struggles or have the capacity to. But what he emphasizes, what Todd captures so well with the title of his book, is sharing what they don't have, right? Is the negative relation they have to one another, and that they can share in a certain sense their intolerance of the conditions.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
So they can not tolerate the objective violence of the system, and they can share that, and they can then attempt to emancipate themselves through another course, right?
Yeah. So the question is, what happens? What do these subjects do when the system is intolerable? So Zizek is kind of moving through different reactions. There's subjective violence. There's the kind of outcropping of dissatisfaction. There's futile actions. There's actions we take.
Projects.
There's actions we take just to ensure that nothing really happens.
Yep.
Like we were saying earlier, with a certain type of like social media activism. But there's many more examples. And then there are real moments of what he calls divine violence. And he also says that why not? We should place this historically. So he says, the revolutionary terror of the French Revolution was divine violence. 1919 in Russia was divine violence. There are concrete events where this actually occurs, and to not make it merely some sort of theoretical concept,
right? Which Benjamin is at danger of doing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Actually, just a note. So maybe we can get to Benjamin here, and he describes this. Zizek has an excerpt from Benjamin where he's describing divine violence as a kind of angel of history, moving forward but facing backwards.
Yeah.
And when I first read this, I was like, man, this must be a great painting. This painting sounds amazing. I look it up and it's like a fucking doodle. It's so bad. It's funny.
The dumbest thing you've ever seen.
It's like, how did you make that beautiful piece of writing out of this fucking painting?
He's going on for pages.
Yeah, and you're like, man, this sounds like the best painting in the world.
It was like the one possession he kept with him all the way until his death.
He's like fleeing the country with this painting.
Yeah, I had the same
Hey man, different
experience.
strokes, different folks. Okay.
If we shared the aesthetic appreciations of the philosophers that we're into, we'd come up with some pretty bizarre tastes. Let's like Adorno not liking the Beatles. I'm not going to get over that one.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
There was another Beatles reference in this book, like humming along to All We Need Is Love.
Yeah.
What is it, like Che Guevara humming along to All We Need Is... Was it Che?
Yeah, something like that.
He does say that, well, this is where he ends it, but violence with love is the kind of revolutionary perspective.
And the violence of love.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, okay, so Benjamin, his shitty painting and concept of divine violence.
It's just so funny to me because I was like, this fucking sucks. This looks like chicken scratch. Like toilet graffiti.
And not in the cool way. Not like you see like some modern art and you're like, okay, I know I don't get it, but I
it's no Basquiat, like whatever. Sorry, Pate.
Yeah, so okay, we're moving away from talking about subjective violence and we're trying to consider objective violence. And there's like there are various types, right? There's the violence that is visited upon the people by the state. That's a kind of objective violence, I think.
Yeah, there's the violence of the economic system.
It's what Benjamin and what Zizek is through Benjamin calling, that would be called mythic violence, right?
Also sometimes called mystic violence. occasionally. Some thinkers
Let's do mythic violence.
a lot of people are saying it.
I'm quoting here: mythic violence is a means to establish the rule of law, the legal social order, while divine violence serves no means, not even that of punishing the culprits and thus reestablishing the equilibrium of justice.
And it's and it's not like this type of action is divine violence. It's contextually it's entirely contextual. So like it's not like Zizek is pointing to like, oh, this type of act, this is divine violence. It's no, this type of act in this moment is divine violence.
Well, it's exactly the same status. I mean, he compares it to Badiou's notion of an event, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like you can't tell before an event happens or even while it's happening necessarily that it's an event, right? It's something that becomes an event with the backward look of history, right? Of the angel.
And the fidelity of the agents involved.
Right. And in that sense, like the divine violence in the revolutionary iteration is like it's something that like, okay, a lot of people have trouble with thinking about communism because of this issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Communism was incredibly violent. And you can see very clearly the victims here in Canada. They're building a memorial to the victims of communism.
Nick, thank you. What's her name? Our deputy prime minister.
Yeah, grandfather was a Nazi.
This is like her pet project, Christina Freeland.
Yeah,
it was violent. Like fair play. To point to those stats misses the point. This is what we were talking about in the COVID conversation a few weeks ago. That's not really what Zizek is talking about. Trying to parse out like, oh, was communism violent? Was it not violent? Or just kind of make excuses.
It's like, no, yes, it was violent.
Yeah.
If someone holds that view and you point out to them that capitalism also sustains itself on an incredible amount of violence, it almost
World War II.
It's hard to even think like, but spontaneously, if you think about it, like it's hard to even really think of what that would be, right? I think people have a hard time with thinking of capitalism as violent on fairly obvious why, but
ideology,
yes.
For example.
Refer to our last episode.
And maybe refer to our most previous last episode for Patreon content. We'll just pitch that.
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah.
They live. People got a kick out of it. We got a kick out of it. It was fun. But maybe we can just try and come up with the definition of divine violence, because we're saying like its effects. Maybe I pull out a quote here. Just give me 1 second.
Well, one definition of divine violence is a means without end, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it can't be justified within the coordinates of the system. The point is not that it has to be justified, but that it's an act that can't be accounted for within the existing conditions.
Yeah, this is where he, notoriously says that Gandhi was extremely violent, but his reason for saying that was because Gandhi's, peaceful protest, his refusal to pay taxes, his vow of nonviolence, etc., was in complete opposition to the colonial British government's laws. Right? It was against.
Yeah, that actually also made me think of like other ways that violence is sort of obscured in our everyday lives. Like you hear on the radio about sanctions that are imposed upon another country, and sanctions are a form of violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
It results in shortage of medical supplies and of starvation. This is like it's a really violent thing to do to a country under which you're imposing the sanctions upon.
Mm-hmm.
Just that made me think of the kind of like the way the violence is sanitized in our.
So like this is slightly going back, but who gets to call it violence and for what reasons is maybe what you're referring to. Like the way in which violence can be understood as like it's
maintaining the state power, right?
Yeah, maintaining state power, also a threat to the state power. So we dislocate violence from being one thing or another. And he writes of divine violence, he says, there's no objective criteria enabling us to identify an act of violence as divine. The same act that to an external observer is merely an outburst of violence can be divine for those engaged in it. There is no big other guaranteeing its divine nature. The risk of reading and assuming it as divine is fully the subject's own. Does it require a recognition? You know what I mean? Like, does it?
Well, it does have connotations of a kind of like of justice, right? Like there's justice.
This is a question. Yeah, this is a question we had in our way back in our event episode. Do those participating in an event know it's an event, right? But maybe in this kind of cant of violence, it becomes slightly clearer. Like if you think, the Russian Revolution, of course, they knew they were committing violence upon the system, the Tsar's family, etc.
Well, actually, he does cite Robespierre perspicuously towards this point, I think, of knowing one is participating in divine violence. I mean, he quotes him by saying, "There do exist, I can assure you, souls that are feeling and pure. It exists that tender, imperious, and irresistible passion, the torment and delight of magnanimous hearts, that deep horror of tyranny, that compassionate zeal for the oppressed, that sacred love for the homeland, that even more sublime and holy love for humanity, without which a great revolution is just a noisy crime that destroys another crime. It does exist, that generous ambition to establish here on earth the world's first republic."
Dude could talk.
Yeah.
Actually, that reminds me. The first time I ever saw the name Zizek, I remember seeing the book on Robespierre. He wrote the introduction about violence and terror on that book. Anyway,
and why he likes Robespierre. I mean, what he says after that quote is that Zizek says, what this leads us to understand is that divine violence belongs to the order of the event. There are no objective criteria enabling us to identify an act of violence as divine. The same act that to an external... Oh, you already read this quote.
I read this, yeah. But it holds up.
It's a good quote.
A lot of people are saying it.
There's something to the idea that there's a suspension of the ethical. Yeah. So he's saying that these desperate acts of violent popular defense were examples of what Benjamin called divine violence, that to be located beyond good and evil in a kind of politico-religious suspension of the ethical. Although we're dealing with what, to an ordinary moral consciousness, cannot but appear as immoral acts of killing, one has no right to condemn them since they were applied to years, centuries even, of systematic state and economic violence and exploitation.
Right. Which is what it's like people, if you're just dealing with it on a subjective empirical level, it's so hard to relate with that abstract nature of objective violence, right? And to allow for it to be an important feature in the actual, material existence of people.
And it's a difficult point to defend if someone isn't going to extend you a bit of charity while you're saying it.
Well, right, because like, okay, we're talking about violence visited upon vast numbers of people, and someone who wouldn't really recognize the difference between communist violence and the Holocaust, right?
Equating them, and then the difficult
what he says about Hitler is important, right? And this Zizek got into a lot of trouble. I feel like, Michael, you want to talk about this?
Well, maybe just tie off. We could get into that in just a second. I just want to say briefly about what the quote Michael pointed out was like, what is ethical depends heavily on the ideological constellation in which you as a viewer find yourself in. Yeah. So exactly. Like Christina Freeland views the violence of communism as the only type of violence of the 20th century. And she's, from her own ethical standpoint, completely right in doing so. But the difficult part is to kind of free violence from that particular context and try and think of, like, it carries with it either the continuation of a violent system or the break with it.
Yeah. So, like, I think in considering this distinction between the communists in Russia, for instance, and the Nazis, it's very clear that the Nazis were using violence as a means of maintaining state power and of propagating a particularistic notion of what a German was, right, and who the enemy was. But I think that, like Zizek says, like the example of the Nazi killing of the Jews and the Revolutionary Terror, where one can also kill without committing a crime and without sacrifice. The difference resides in the fact that the Nazi killing remains a means of state power, remains a means of the state power, because divine violence is something that sort of like sweeps as if from nowhere. It's not propagated by anyone resembling the Nazis, right? Doing it for perspicuous reasons to,
You mean this is what he would say to someone calling what the Nazis was doing divine violence, or to suppose that violence has anything to do with a kind of emancipatory act?
Yes,
you know what I mean?
Both of those things.
Yeah. So, like, in distinction to calling what the Nazis did divine violence,
yeah,
their violence was like the kind of most extreme example of the violence that is used to maintain the present system.
Yeah, it was a revolution so that there would not be a revolution, and it was a revolution of the same, right, or of the worst factor or features of the same.
Reminiscent of every fascism is the result of a failed revolution.
Yeah, failed revolution. Yeah. I saw Visconti's The Leopard the other day. Have you guys seen that?
No, I haven't.
Big 3-hour Italian epic. But there was a quote in there, basically, everything must change so that everything can stay the same.
Mm-hmm.
Or, another phrasing, if we want things to stay as they are, they will have to change. That kind of,
Mm-hmm.
for Hitler, it does remain that it was an event that it was a conservative event, right? That it wanted to maintain the conditions. So in order for things to stay the same, there was that kind of pseudo activity.
Along those same lines, but sort of on the other side of the coin, I was thinking of there's a quote that made me think of this from that chapter. Zizek says the second lesson of the book is it's difficult to be really violent, to perform an act that violently disturbs the basic parameters of social life. The thing that popped in my head when I read that was Crime and Punishment. The Raskolnikov, I think, is the main character of that book. He's trying to devise a crime that is just, right? And he decides to kill this horrible old lady that is fucking his life up and fucking up the lives of a few people that he knows.
His landlord, right? I think it's his landlord.
I think it's his landlord. Yeah, I read this book a long time ago, but he's trying to devise a subjective crime that will at the same time violently disturb the basic parameters of social life by proving to people that such a crime is worthy and just to carry out. And what he runs into is the impossibility of such an act. And it's what Zizek calls a lac de passage, right? Lac de passage.
Passage l'acte. Passage à l'acte. Yeah.
Yeah, passage à l'acte. Which in the same way, I think, like, he talks about the fantastic Harrison Ford movie. I don't care what he says.
Let's talk about that after Crime and Punishment, because I like the connection you're drawing.
Well, I mean, that's kind of what
it's an action. It's an action that's like a kind of futile action that is a symptom of the violence of the system, but doesn't actually do anything about it. So, like,
right,
what the main character in Crime and Punishment does is he attempts to, like, this woman is more of a,
like, she's clearly a
representation of the system as such.
Exactly, yeah.
And he's engaging with it on a subjective level, viewing her as the culprit. And
yeah. And she very much is the culprit, but he doesn't see the way that it reaches beyond into a category of objective violence that he can't attribute to it, right?
And then in The Fugitive, which is fucking great, banging movie.
So like,
very good.
Zizek points out, like, this is kind of the mistake of scores of Hollywood movies. I mean, actually, including They Live, of the innocent persecuted lead role who encounters the bad guy and focuses all of his activity on defeating the bad guy and not seeing how the bad guy, right, is actually a part of, like, a stand-in for the oppression of the system. So, like, in The Fugitive, the bad guy is the one-armed doctor who kills his wife. Obviously a horrific crime. And he spends the movie trying to find this guy, and, like, he's running away from the cops. It's a lot of fun, by the way, folks. It's a fantastic movie. But at the end, like, it turns out that this guy has been doing this on behalf of the medical companies. Like, he's been
the hospital that
and instead of the recognition that this has tendrils which reach out above and beyond the bad actor, Harrison Ford just engages in a long protracted fight with this guy. Also, like, quite, like, in the same way as They Live, I think it's quite a long fight scene.
Harrison Ford was never great in action scenes.
What are you talking about? Temple of Doom.
Do you think, like, his
Temple of Doom is the worst? And why did you say Temple of Doom?
Yeah, that's the worst one, bro.
I think because I always loved as a kid the punching in Temple of Doom.
Yeah, just to punch home that point about the bad guy that Zizek does in this great way. The bad guy is transformed into a vicious, sneering, pathological character, as if psychological depravity somehow replaces and displaces the anonymous, utterly non-psychological drive of capital.
Mm-hmm. And this is what Stieg Larsson does so well in The Girl with Dragon Tattoo.
I just saw that movie a couple days ago again.
He reverses it.
Say more.
Well, because Michael, what's Michael Blomkvist? Yeah. He takes, like, the series, like, begins where he's investigating this disappearance, and then he links it with the greater story of the kind of system, the political dark underside of the functioning of the political system, where this is part of the very functioning of government.
And you mean in The Girl Play with Fire?
Yeah.
Actually, it's really cool because the beginning of the first book, The Girl with Dragon Tattoo, he's written an article exposing this billionaire, right? And he gets sued for libel.
Yeah.
And then he goes into, like, the subjective level of violence, right?
Yeah.
Where the Harriet has been allegedly killed, and he's trying to find her, her murderer, and then there's like all the stuff that happens with Lisbeth. Also extreme subjective violence, and as you said, in Girl Play with Fire, it showed like in the context of like human trafficking and prostitution. And
So
then
he brings it into the greater context.
then the last book he talks about the political sphere. There's all these.
Yeah.
He talks about all these neo-Nazis that are in the politics of Sweden.
Yeah.
Oh,
And then he,
cool.
and then he
That's
got
really
killed.
cool.
And then he got killed.
Then he died
Yeah,
mysteriously.
He mysteriously died.
Yeah, right when he
The
finished.
writer, not the main character. The writer, Stieg Larsson.
Yeah. Anyway, we're rambling on here. Do we have any Michael, do you have any points that you want to hit home before we wind down the episode?
I thought this was interesting. He was saying, this is 2008. So the prospect of ecological crisis is paradigmatic here. What if what makes us unable to act is not the fact that we do not know enough? Is human industry really responsible for global warming, etc.? But on the contrary, the fact that we know too much and do not know what to do with this mass of inconsistent knowledge, how to subordinate it to a master signified.
And I think, the master signified is the violence kind of reframes the master signifier, right? Like, because it's violence against the kind of hegemonic master signifier towards a new one, right?
Yeah, because that's what's so nuanced about the eventual status of divine violence. So if a irrational outburst, as it's seen within the lens of subjective violence, an event gets located or situated within the ideological coordinates of late capital, but divine violence is an act that can't be justified within those coordinates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
And that's the openness of history, because you have to see within the present conditions or the past that openness, because its meaning is not inherent, and it's open to another reading.
And even even the past itself is open when it gets reframed.
Yeah, because there can be an event that emerges. Some like, doesn't matter what the event is. An event happens and it gets placed within a historical lineage. Something from the past, some vanishing mediator, now is situated within that lineage. It gets reframed.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like violence can at once be the normal function of a system, the futile attempt to point to the issues or
real
fight
objective
against
conditions of it.
Yeah. It can be that act of obscuring it. It can also be the pastor's act of attempting to fight against it, and it can also be what is required and necessitated to reframe the coordinates of a new system, of an emancipatory act. So like
Exactly.
this is what Jack is discussing with violence. It's all of these things, and it's what makes it a banging book.
Well, that's what's interesting about that kind of coincidence of opposites for violence and non-violence. So Zizek basically ends up advocating for that Bartlebian non-violence as a way of disrupting the perpetuation of exploitation or what have you.
Towards what we were just saying, very brief point, topic of the Nazis, it's one of my interests, that period of time. I'm watching this great documentary on the Nazis. Anyway, it's got really crazy interviews with people who are Nazis. Really insane. But one thing that one of the women said really stuck with me. She said, "We were the ones that went along." That is not, I would prefer not to, right? You can't picture the Nazis saying, I would prefer not to. It's impossible.
Yeah. And then that shows that the violence of the system functioning as it normally would.
Mm-hmm.
They were following the ethical standard of the system itself.
And that's what they all said. I was just
and to oppose it was an act of violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. A violence in the Gandinian sense, right?
Yeah, that's
good. I
think
that.
Just one more thing while I think about it. I like this bit from the afterword to In Defense of Lost Causes. He was Zizek saying, "In all honesty, I have to admit that every time I travel to Israel, I experience the strange thrill of entering a forbidden territory of illegitimate violence. Does this mean I am not so secretly an anti-Semite? But what disturbs me is precisely that I find myself in a state which hasn't yet obliterated the founding violence of its origins, repressed them into a timeless past. In this sense, what the state of Israel confronts us with is merely the obliterated past of every state power. Benjamin's problem here is how, if at all, we might break out of this mythic violence and or the legal order that relies on it. His answer is through divine violence, a violence which is not lawmaking but law destroying.
Very cool.
Yeah, beautiful.
I think that's a good place to end it, fellas. What do you think?
Yep.
Cool.
We got Will, Michael, Peter, Jake.
Jake in absentia, is that the word? I think it's in absentia.
Jake is abstinent. Jake, if you're listening, fuck you, but also come back, please.
He should have just commented the podcast and said present, and then that would be it.
Okay, Zizek and So On. See you guys later.
See you. See Mike. See Peter.
And so on and so on. 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 And so on and so on.